getting recorded now. So you guys can go live.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar with my friend Pradeep Chakravarthy, the historian from Chennai, but who's also, interestingly, and this is very relevant for the next 1 hour, he's also an HR consultant. Welcome, Pradeep, to Marcellus's webinar.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you for this opportunity.
So folks will follow a pattern, a sequence of events which will be very familiar to many of you. So I'll introduce Pradeep, then we will engage in a Q&A for the first 30 minutes. Please fire your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. In the second half of the hour, I'll take as many of your questions as possible. Normally, my colleague Salil Desai is here to do the honors. He's under the weather, so I'll moderate the second half as well. So before I start asking Pradeep the dozens of questions which I want to put to him, let me introduce Pradeep formally because he's a very interesting person. Those of you who haven't read his book Leadership Shastra, here's the background. He's an HR consultant, but he's also an historian, right? He's written 9 books, hundreds of articles on history. He's written in The Lonely Planet, The Hindu, Marg. His wisdom has been shared through leading forums like TEDx. In terms of his professional career, he's had a stellar one. After graduating from the London School of Economics, my alma mater as well. After graduating from the LSE, he worked in Cognizant, in Infosys, in McKinsey. And just to give you a sense of the seniority of the man, in Infosys, he was in charge of learning and development for 40,000 employees around the world. And in McKinsey, he worked with clients across Asia to drive profits, revenues, enhance customer experience. And that's the sort of commercial background he's brought to the writing of Indian history. And that's why I think he's a fascinating person to talk to. His book, Leadership Shastra, is just as interesting to read. So Pradeep, privileged to have you on this webinar. And many of us are looking forward to learning plenty. So before I sort of ask you about the book itself, if I look at the book and I said I'll list folks the characters covered in Leadership Shastra. Pradeep's got Malik Amber, the various Deccan Sultanates. So this is Birar, Bijapur, Golconda, etc. Chhatrapati Shivaji is in Leadership Shastra. There's Ahilyabai Holkar from Indore. There's Babur, Jahanara. This is Shah Jahan's daughter Jahanara. There's Aurangzeb. Then the first 5 Sikh gurus. Then there's a section in Pradeep's book called Stories from the South. He's covered Marthanda Varma, a person I didn't know much about until I read Leadership Shastra. There's Tipu Sultan. There's Sarfoji II of Thanjavur. And whilst I know a little bit about Sarfoji, it's all thanks to Pradeep. A year and a half ago, Pradeep took me around Thanjavur. He took me around Sarfoji's palace in Thanjavur, and fascinating character. Then Sankaradeva, the Ahoms of Assam. This is Lachit Barphukan that many of you would have heard about. And then Pradeep's got a section in his book about leaders who did not enlarge their potential. He's covered Osman Ali of Hyderabad and the Mughals after Aurangzeb. So fascinating set of characters that you've covered in Leadership Shastra, Pradeep. What led you to write such a book, which is sort of taking history and making it relevant for business people like us?
Right. So for most people, or I might actually say for all people, history is something that we all studied in school. I think very, very few of us found it relevant. Most of us would have found it boring. Most of us would have found it irrelevant. And for those of us who liked it, it was probably because it was just a good storyteller teaching us history. Yeah. My understanding of history was very different. I had the privilege of spending summer vacations in my ancestral home, which had belonged to 6 generations of my family. And one day in the attic, I found a maths textbook, which some ancestor of mine, more than 100 years back, had written, doodled on the book. And in that notebook, that boy had written, "I hate maths." And it was something that I really connected with. So here was a guy, I didn't even know how he was related to me. He was writing in that old pen and ink, and the book was frayed, it was tattered, it was brown paper, but the thought was the same. And suddenly it dawned on me that here was a person who lived 100 years before me, literally no connection with me, I mean, in terms of the way we lived our lives, but we had this emotion that was the same. And it then occurred to me that across time, human nature has not changed. We all, none of these people that I've written about, none of them woke up in the morning and said, hey, I'm going to be figured in Leadership Shastra by Pradeep Chakravarthy, and Saurabh and I are going to get discussing this. They all woke up and did their own things, just like we do the same thing. So I have then, because I've worked with human behavior in organizations like McKinsey, for other clients, for Infosys, for internal purposes, I saw that the way we deal with ourselves, the way we deal with others, which is so critical for our performance, is very similar to the way people thought of dealing with themselves and others in the past. And because human nature doesn't change, if you strip the dates away from history, which is the boring stuff, right? Which, I mean, why do you need to know when Sarfoji lived or when Malik Ambar lived? It's really not important. But what did they want? How did they achieve that? Did it last for a long time? Because we are all, at some point in time after our 40s, we are all obsessed with the legacy that we want to leave, the impact that we want to create. Then it becomes a very relevant question. And because human nature does not change, if we look at the human nature part of historical personalities, we can learn something for our own lives.
Interesting. So Pradeep, let me sort of take your book and sort of break it into two parts, right? There are figures in Leadership Shastra, figures that we would conventionally say in Indian life that these are kind of known heroes, right? So Chhatrapati Shivaji, Babur, Tipu Sultan, right? People that we have read plenty about in our history textbooks. If you sort of start with these sort of conventional lions and lionesses of Indian history, the Baburs, the Tipu Sultans, the Shivajis, what are our takeaways? What are the takeaways that business people like us need to take away from the conventional stories of great valor and achievement in Indian history?
Right. So there are two takeaways, I would say. One is if you look at it from a holistic organization perspective, and the second is from an individual perspective. From the organization perspective, the larger the organization becomes, the older we become as in terms of our age, the more rigid we become, the less open to change we become, and the more bureaucratic we become. And if you look at the Mughal Empire, for example, what started off with Babur and what ended after Aurangzeb, the issues that they faced in Assam with the Ahoms, the issues that they faced with the Marathas and Shivaji was very much the same. The army in the Mughal times was so bureaucratic that to just change direction from left or right, it took about 2-3 days for that whole chain of command. Yeah. And I think older organizations, and I'm saying, I mean, whatever is old in your industry, right? It could vary. It could be just 2 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. The more we get entrapped in processes that this is the way it should be done, very surely we're going down the Mughal Empire path of ultimate dissolution. If we are agile and if we are nimble, and it's not something that happens just once every crisis when you call a consultant who does it for you. It has to happen on a very regular 6-monthly or even a yearly feature where you sit back and say, where have we gone from X to today? What are processes that are pulling us back that we need to change? Whether it's with a response to our customers, whether it's response to our vendors, whether it's responses to our employees, in terms of number of days, in terms of number of hours. Number one. The second thing is, as we grow older, and you see this with Jahangir, you see this with Aurangzeb, as we grow older, we tend to become rigid. So it's not just at an organization level, it's at a personal level. So anybody in our 40s, in our 50s, we need to be more careful when we are saying no, because we are maybe saying no through our comfort zone rather than what the organization will be. So this is at an organization level. At a systemic level, if you look at Malik Ambar, you look at Sarfoji, you look at Martanda Varma, you look at Jahanara, you look at Ahilyabai Holkar, all of these, you look at Babur, all of these people, they have all faced enormous troubles and difficulties in their lives. But they figure in the book, they figure in history, because they didn't keep cribbing about it. They actually went and did something about it. And despite Sarfoji, for example, was a particular eye-opener for me, because I wrote that chapter during the lockdown. And during the lockdown, there were so many excuses for us not to do anything, right down from fitness and health, right? I'm sitting in the apartment, I can't go out. Why should I bother? Why can't I eat whatever I want? But even in that restricted space, can I work on my health and fitness? Yeah. These were the inspiring lessons. So these guys, they did not speak about their problems alone. They actually went and solved it. So I might say people who really benefited from this book, one small thing that they could do after reading those chapters is every day, can you maintain a journal where at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and about 10 o'clock in the night before you go to bed, make a small update and say, today, how many times did I complain about things around me without working on the solution? How many times am I talking about the problem without being part of the solution? I think that would be a great insight for us to look at from these leaders who actually created success after them.
So folks, as you can make out, right, Pradeep is a sort of treasure house of knowledge on Indian history and how that can be applied to corporate life. So feel free to punch in your questions in the Q&A box. I'll try to take as many of them as I can during this session. So Pradeep, let's move on to what I thought was the most sort of fascinating aspect of the book, right? These figures that I thought were marginally important in Indian history, say Shah Jahan's daughter Jahanara, right, who I thought was a marginally important figure. In your book, she emerges as a solid power broker not only under Shah Jahan, but also under Aurangzeb, right? And yet this is a woman, not even a queen. She's not Mumtaz Mahal. She's Shah Jahan's daughter. She's not the formal queen either under Shah Jahan or under Aurangzeb, yet manages to wield enormous power. Similarly, Ahilyabai Holkar, not born to royalty, got married to royalty. The king died. I think the king's son also died. And somehow Ahilyabai Holkar had this legendary reign in Indore. When I go to Indore on business trips, I can still see a statue over there. And these sorts of figures, right? Whether it's Jahanara, a woman, Ahilyabai Holkar, another woman, Malik Ambar, born in Africa as a slave, exported from Africa to the Middle East. From Middle East, he got exported to India. And yet this man ruled a big part of the Deccan for 40 years, right? What are the lessons from these unconventional success stories? What can we take away into our business life?
The number one lesson I can see from these three people and from many others is if you want to make impact, you don't necessarily need formal authority. Yeah. Today, it's very easy to say this, right? And I've had this problem in HR a lot of the times. Make me vice president, then I will behave like one. It doesn't work that way. We've got to be a vice president in behavior first, and only then the promotion comes. Yeah, but we all get tricked into this at some point in time or the other. And you look at Jahanara's life, right? It's at a time when generally women don't have much power. It's the Mughal Empire, for God's sake, where they have absolutely no power. They can't. I mean, their parda can't even go out frequently. And look at the people in her life. Okay, today we might crib that, oh, the head of marketing doesn't get along with the head of quality of production. She is talking between 3 or 4 men who actually kill each other. I mean, Aurangzeb, we all know what he did to Shah Jahan. We don't know what Shah Jahan did to his father, which is just as bad. Yeah. So she had to work this balance between men who were really powerful and who had no qualms about, killing each other. And yet she was able to create impact. She was able to maintain that balance so much that Aurangzeb was such a difficult man. I mean, I'm sure, though we're talking about all the people in the book, Saurabh, in my experience of talking about this book in the last 1 year, 1.5 years, quickly it becomes a discussion on Aurangzeb. So let me place it up front, right? Why do we love to hate Aurangzeb so much today? Why is he so controversial? If you look at the statistics, Aurangzeb is actually the leader that we should be following. He was focused on the top line. He was focused on the bottom line. He had an enormous sense of personal example. So if he wasn't the CEO who said something and did something, he walked the talk, right? He was actually there everywhere where his army was fighting. And the Mughal Empire was at its largest at his time, right? And size matters today. Your worth is decided by the number of branches that you have, the number of clients that you have. And Aurangzeb did all of that stuff. But he is hated by so many people today because he was very clear. It was my way or the highway. Right? He would not stand people who did not agree with it. And it's not just the Hindus, it was with the Muslims as well. With a man like this, she was able to work on a relationship, support his brother, whom he killed eventually. And yet when he came to power, he made her the first lady of the empire. So this speaks for a lot of her ability to get stuff done and play this balance. Ahilyabai Holkar again, yeah. Of course, she needed the support of men in the life. But these men would have supported her because she had that inner grit and the ability to work with tribals, the ability to get social welfare projects using the temples as a method, was looking at how can I use existing infrastructure to improve my welfare activities. Yeah, this is with Ahilyabai Holkar. Malik Ambar, a slave who comes into Maharashtra. Imagine even today, right? We still struggle with diversity. An African slave in Maharashtra in the 17th century, unheard of. Yeah, this man is able to come to power because he's a really good warrior, and he makes that smart move of not through overthrowing the king. He's always only the prime minister. He's never the king. So he knew what counted for him, and it is okay sometimes when you don't have to call the shots. It's okay to fire across from somebody's shoulder. Until the end, I mean, there's this little anecdote I put over there. Jahangir was a really powerful Mughal emperor. Till the end, Jahangir could not defeat Malik Ambar. And Jahangir had a fabulous painting done. I think it's still in the British Museum or somewhere. There's a globe. Jahangir is standing on top of the globe, as if he's like the head of the king of the world. And he's firing an arrow, which is beheading Malik Ambar. That's all. It was just a painting. Till the end, Jahangir could never realize it. I mean, imagine the anger Jahangir would have had in this little tiny fellow, this African chap, not even a king, just a small, piddly little minister. I'm not able to defeat him with the entire Mughal army. And Malik Ambar is somebody that we need to remember, especially in Maharashtra. Malik Ambar's general was Maloji, and Maloji learned Malik Ambar's techniques, and he taught it to his grandson, who happens to be Shivaji the Great. So if Shivaji was able to outwit the Mughals because he knew when to zip up and keep quiet and when to fight, if he knew how to outwit the Mughals because he did all this guerrilla warfare, it's actually techniques that he learned from Malik Ambar.
Fascinating. So given that you referenced Shivaji and Malik Ambar together, right? I have to say, whilst reading about Shivaji and Malik Ambar in your book, I had this sort of uncomfortable feeling that leadership is actually far harder than it's made out to be, because in both of these chapters, the Shivaji chapter and the Malik Ambar chapter, what you highlight is not only did these two men have to be sort of very cunning warriors, they have to be very cunning warriors doing all this guerrilla warfare in the Maharashtra countryside, but they also had to be very good administrators.
Yeah.
To run the country, generate the cash flow, so that the wars could be financed, right? And this sort of dual nature of leadership, that you don't just have to be good at one thing. If you're just good at fighting, but you can't run the operating cash flow, then boss, your wars are not going to get financed, right?
Very true.
This duality of history, right? What should people who are watching today, people who want to rise in corporate life, what are we supposed to do? I mean, we struggle to be good at one thing, yeah. How are we supposed to be good at multiple things?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question that you asked. And it will particularly be a struggle for people who have been trained as engineers. Because in the education system, in engineering, your mind is focused on getting one right answer. So if you are working on leadership with people and you're searching for one right answer, it ain't going to come. People aren't machines. It's not going to come that way. You need to be able to look at diversity of opinions, of working with two things. If you say how many people are on this call, yeah, sure, I have the number. I can tell you one exact answer, right? How can we make this call effective? There are many things that we can do. So we need to be comfortable with duality. And duality comes through learning of the arts and social sciences, which is why learning history and philosophy is really important. If you look at some of the great business leaders across the world, they may not have been just engineers. They would have also been good with arts or philosophy, literature, because that encourages a diversity of opinion. So the traditional Indian way of looking at this is always like dharma, right? You don't have one answer for dharma. It's always for dharma. It's your dharma and it's the outside dharma. In leadership today, we go by a very Western management science concept, which reduces everything in leadership in HR to numbers. It works for the top line, bottom line, and you need numbers. I'm not going to say you don't need it, but that's not the only part. We need to be able to be comfortable with this and that, not or. Both of these are important. And the minute we start looking at human beings as resources, which is what Aurangzeb done, you can make a lot of impact. Aurangzeb had a lot of impact, but it's not sustainable over a long period of time. So I think engineers will particularly struggle with this, which is why I think they need the help of arts and literature and history to help them see the other point of view as well.
Right. So for all the engineers who will watch this, and for people like me who studied economics and thought there was one answer. There is hope. In my case, it took me the best part of 20 years to figure out that I don't have all the answers, and I need to build a far stronger team, have diversity in the team. But had I read Leadership Shastra 20 years ago, Pradeep, I would have learned from Amber and from Shivaji that you build diverse teams for both men. It's very interesting. For both men, what I could find out in your book is their leadership was diverse. They had Hindu generals, they had Muslim generals, they had Marathi generals, they had Kannadiga generals, they had Rajputs in their ranks, they had foreigners in their ranks. I think Malik Amber's 40% of his army were Africans, right?
Yeah.
So it's unbelievable, right? 16th century India, this army in Western India was 40% African, and it's a very interesting point that you made, that if you want to build an empire, a business empire, or an empire in the sense of a kingdom, and you want to be good at multiple things, then that multiplicity of strength has to come from diversity in the team rather than the king being good at multiple things.
And you see the reverse as well, right? With Tipu Sultan, he did many things right. He understood that the difficulty the British were going to give him. He worked really hard in Kerala. He brought in a lot of reforms. Kerala was being ruined and abused by the Portuguese and the Dutch. He really fixed that. But today we hate him, and many of us hate him at least. And he wasn't successful in the end. He was defeated by the British, because by the time he had seized up the British, the power of the British, none of his neighbors came to help him. They all fought against him because he had not built alliances with his neighbors. He had fought with all his neighbors, and none of them came to help him. In fact, they were people like Martanda Varma or the Nizam of Hyderabad. They supported the East India Company against Tipu, even though they knew what they were doing was going to come back and bite them.
So it's a little bit out of syllabus, I know, Pradeep, but I can't help but ask you this. Tipu Sultan, it is what it is. He didn't build alliances with his neighbors. He paid the price for it. I think he was let down by one of his own generals, right? The fellow locked the palace door and left him to die in the hands of the English. But how come the Vijaynagar Empire made that same mistake, right? How come the Vijayanagar Empire allowed the other Deccan Sultanates to gang up on them, and that famous battle of Saraighat, right?
Talikot,
yeah. So Saraighat is Lachit Bharpur.
Yeah.
Battle of Talikot. Why did Vijayanagar make the same mistake of not doing M&A alliances with other Deccan Sultanates, and left themselves so exposed?
So Vijayanagar as a Hindu kingdom was always fighting in the top with the Mughal, with the Deccan Sultanates.
Yeah.
Till there were strong kings like Krishnadeva in the Vijayanagar period, they could keep them off. Yeah. But when the kings started becoming weaker, when they started focusing less on administration, less on military prowess, less on keeping the army fit and as a fiddle, they started losing out. And they started having to import more and more Muslims into the system. And some of the Deccan Sultans used this against them.
Okay.
But more than blaming the Deccan Sultanates, I think, look, it takes two hands to clap. If you look at the trajectory of the Vijayanagar kings after Krishnadeva, they largely lived a good life. So yes, corporate social responsibility is important. Yes, what the company does to the community is important, but that can't be the main purpose of the company. The main purpose of the company should be in generating profits, should be in adding value to customers. And if we lose that, then you're going down the Vijayanagar way, and there is going to be a Deccan Sultanate which is going to take you over. And I think one example that I can see in my own life is one of the organizations that I work with. They would do their customer survey for about 3 months, and they will pile on hundreds of questions to their customers. And they would come back and, they'd have the same action points as they had last time. So clearly you're not hearing the voice of the customer. Clearly you're not practicing whatever the customers have spoken. It becomes like a tick-off. And if organizations start doing that, then they're going in the Vijayanagar way, where they're looking more inward. Then they're not going to be looking outward, and that's going to lead them into trouble eventually.
So basically, in sort of for people in the stock market, promoters with private jets, red flag was. Promoters with private jets, a big red flag.
Yeah.
So let's now come to something that you've turned into a very successful career, which is helping executives like us take the lessons from history and turn it into a tool for self-assessment, a tool for self-development, self-motivation. Tell us more about that. Where do you get the idea from? How does this work? How can people like me take history and become better at my job, at my sort of whatever leadership skills I have?
So I've looked at history, and I've also looked at Indian history and philosophy and mythology. Devdutt Patnaik helped me a lot at that point in time. If all of us are obsessed about performance, whether it's personal performance, whether it's our organization performance. And when we talk about performance, there are two parts to it. One is the task, getting the job done. One is the relationships, the people that we work with. Traditional management science approaches typically focus on the task, and people are treated as resources. The Indian tradition is very different. If you look at the patterns of all these people in the Leadership Shastra who've created lasting impact for a long period of time, their approach has been different. It has always been focused on relationships so that jobs will get done. If this has to be done, there are two attitude changes that need to happen. One is we need to recognize that people are different, not right or wrong, but just different. Yeah, easier said than done. Because if we go back and look at our most dysfunctional relationships, some at work, at home, wherever, somewhere in that dysfunctional relationship will be an expectation that that person should be thinking and doing like me, which can't happen. Those of us who have two children, those of us who have a sibling, parents give the same kind of attention, but our personalities are so different. So in our own homes, if it's like that, how can you expect that another person from another background to be like? So that's the first recognition that I need to have. So workshop goes a lot more into that. The second is a recognition that if I need to create something that's eternal and universal, I cannot do it on my own. I need to do it with other people. Yeah, and I think lessons of Tipu Sultan, Martandavarma, all of them come on this. Yeah. If these two lessons are in the mind, our speeches and our actions will change, where we look at exchanges and dialogues rather than debates and one-way transactions. So I would then have to say, hey, I want you to do this for me. We don't stop there. The critical part is, if I want you to do this for me, what can I do for you in return to help you? And then there is a conversation happening, which is really what the Yajna is all about. And I bring in archetypes there, the Asura, the Rakshasa, the Yajaman, the Devata, the Bhagwan, all of them come in over the Yaksha, all of them come in over there. And this is usually a two and a half a day workshop. At the end of the sessions, typically what I've seen is the number of blame games goes down tremendously. You said this, I said this, that sort of stuff goes down tremendously. People recognize that when I have a team of people reporting to me, I am not doing a favor to them by being their manager. They are actually doing a favor to me by being on my team. And for added impact, I do this in a place like Tanjavur, where you can actually see how the Cholas did this in their different inscriptions. And Cholas had the same kind of problems that we face today. There were people who didn't get along with each other. There were people who had to work with each other. People didn't pay the money that they owed the state. Kings had to deal with it. All the issues that we face today were faced at that time. In fact, it was even more complicated at those days, without technology and without all the systems and checks that we have in place. This is typically the workshop that I do for them. And then, of course, there are one-to-one coaching sessions.
Just to clarify, folks, I know this is Marcellus, but the Cholas Pradeep is referring to is not the Cholamandalam company that we are shareholders. This is the Chola kingdom from 1,000 years ago, just in case anybody got it wrong. So Pradeep, I'm now gonna beam up a part of the book which I found very interesting, and I hope those who are watching also find this interesting. Now, the reason I'm going to do this is the part which intrigued me the most, right? Right towards the end, you talk about sadhana, right? So you talk about sadhana using corporate beliefs. Using your knowledge, and you talk about the Sakhi, a friend, a companion who will offer you non-judgmental support, right? Can you talk about these two concepts a little? What is sadhana, using this book to examine your beliefs and behavior, and what is Sakhi, and how does this sadhana and Sakhi stuff, how does this intertwine with your self-development point?
So the focus of the book is on improving performance. Improving your personal performance, looking at the organization, improving organization performance. This cannot happen if at a very if you have only thoughts at a macro level. It has to go down to day-to-day actions where your thoughts, your speeches, and your behavior. And I'm differentiating between these three. Thinking, speaking, and doing is different. It's difficult to change one's behavior because it's been set over a long period of time. Yeah. And these are just reminders that help you. It can be very intimidating. So the sadhana or tapasya is really about complete focus practice on a regular basis. It can be very daunting to do on your own. We need the help of somebody else. So the focus on traditional Indian methodology is because we believe people first and then work. It also means that when you work with people, you need to work with somebody else, which is where the Saki comes in. So the outline that I've given is you read each chapter, have a conversation with somebody else. And fortunately, as you notice, the chapters are small. The history is very little. It's the application that is more focused on. Even in the history, I've kept dates to a very bare minimum because the point is not when it happened. The point is what happened and why it happened and how it happened, how it can be applied to you. If you have these kind of conversations with a Saki, both of us tend to learn. And it makes the behavior change easier because you work with somebody else, there's some companionship, and B, it works as an accountability partner as well. I can be anybody. It could be somebody at work, it could be somebody at home, anybody is fine. So that chapter actually came from about 20 years of working in learning and development, Saurabh, where I've seen the struggle people have. I mean, they go through a great workshop, but then there's very little that changes after the workshop. Yeah. And a lot of that part of the chapter came from that.
So as promised at the half-hour point, we'll switch to questions from the audience. So you're getting some really interesting questions coming through. Folks, feel free to pump in more. So the first question is, are there any marked differences that you've seen, Pradeep? Are there any marked differences in the leadership styles of people who've inherited their title, for example, Akbar, versus those who founded the kingdom? For example, a Babur, or say grabbed power, say a Malik Ambar, right? So between inheritors and founders, is there a difference in leadership styles?
Look, I would say there is a more marked difference after, say, fourth, fifth generations. First 2 or 3 generally focus on being very efficient rulers and administrators. It's in the 4th or the 5th generation where they become a little bit less focused on their core business, which is administration and keeping the army happy. So I would say rather than leadership style, in the first 2-3 generations is more from the 4th or the 5th. And then you have people like Aurangzeb and the Mughals, right? The Mughal tradition of succession was very different. The Mughals actively said that at the end of the death of one king, the successors should fight with each other and may the best man win. And I never understood this because this seems like such an inefficient way to work. But if you go to where the Mughals came from originally, which is Mongolia, right? Mongol is what became Mughal. And you see the aridness of the landscape. It's a really tough landscape. And it helps if that leader is a really tough person. Can you beat it? In the Mongols who were able to conquer such a large part of the world, the Gobi Desert has salt, but they didn't know how to salt their food. So they actually chewed on raw meat or dried meat all the time. So a really tough community. And there it meant that the next person who succeeded has to be so tough that he has to kill off all the potential heirs to the throne. So they had a very different system where it was the fittest will survive. But then you have the exception of people like Martanda Varma, who comes much later into the Travancore dynasty, but he is a different person. So it's difficult to put a rule over there. But generally, if you're the 3rd or the 4th successor in a family-owned business, for example, you got to be extra careful about not being complacent.
So since you have raised this question, right, it's a big part of our work. I would say roughly 1/3 of our work is this succession planning stuff, figuring out which companies are going to get their succession planning right and which are going to make a right royal mess out of it. And if they're going to make a mess, we have to make a judgment, reduce the position size, and so on. So basis your study of Indian history, right, which is the best way? What is the best way to go about succession planning? You mentioned primogeniture, which is the eldest son, I guess, right? Not eldest born, eldest son. Then there's the Mughal way, which is have a right royal fight amongst yourselves, maim and kill. Your cat is also getting involved. This is very interesting. Yeah. It's a house full of intellectuals. So basis your study of Indian history, which is the right way to go about succession planning?
Over here, I think this is not an issue that you're struggling with only today, Saurabh. This is an issue that people have been struggling from the days of the Mahabharata, right? If you look at the Mahabharata story, what is the mistake that Dhritarashtra does? he chooses love and affection over merit. And if you look at the stories of the kings who have been able to safeguard their kingdom for at least 3-4 generations, like the Cholas would be a great example. Those of you who watched PS1 documents the history of Rajaraja Chola. The Cholas were able to manage their succession very well because the current king chose his heir apparent while he was alive, allowed him, made him focus on merit. So the Yuvraj had to conquer a territory on his own, administer it for some time, and then he was anointed the successor, ruled jointly with the father, and only then took over. So if there are heads of organizations who are not willing to bite the bullet and say that, look, this person may be the eldest, but he is not the most qualified, I think it's going to be very difficult for that organization to do well. I think that's where I work with CEOs of founder CEOs, where they have spent their entire life building that company, which is more precious to them than their baby. And they are scared, they are afraid, because they don't have any other interest apart from that company. And they're not willing to let go. And if they're not willing to let go, they're not willing to allow their children to let go, to come in either. Those are all warning signs for the longevity of the company.
Yeah. So Dinesh Gupta asks very interesting questions. How can one build a corporate culture, right? Basis your study of Indian history, how can one build a corporate culture where the organization, where employees believe that the organization comes before themselves, right? So which are, there must be rulers who are able to instill enormous faith in the kingdom, in the sort of royal seat, and where the soldiers and the public believed, the population believed that the empire and the broader kingdom came before their individual identities. How can we sort of, which are the rulers we can learn from, and how can we do that in corporate life, Pradeep?
I look at 3 people. Babur, because he was able to keep his religious and personal preferences aside and do things that would endear him to his troops. Yeah. He says, I shouldn't be drinking in my religion, but it's okay for me to do it. And this whole concept of jihad, right? Fighting for a cause was something Babur was very good at doing. He was able to tap onto the emotions of his army rather than their intellect. And commitment happens through emotions. Compliance happens through the mind. So whatever we do around managing the emotions of people will help. Sankaradeva also does that in terms of using art, music and dance and plays and theater, using art to help the people. The guy that I would like to talk about the most is Martandavarma, who works really hard to stabilize his position. And then he does the ultimate thing. At the end, he gives away his entire kingdom to the Padmanabha Swami temple, which very smartly what he does is, after that, he says, I'm ruling on behalf of the God. So if you oppose me, you're opposing God. See, in those days, religion was a very important part of one's identity. Today, it is not. Today, what can serve the cause of religion is the company values. And in almost all organizations that I've consulted with, company values tend to be lovely posters that are on the wall. There is very little effort that leaders make to actually get those company values internalized as personal values within people. If that can happen on a periodic basis, I know McKinsey used to and still does a great job in doing that. It's very simple. Every quarter, you have a conversation where each person talks about how their personal values match with the company's values. And especially the difficult decisions, Saurabh, there would have been a time, this is where in our mythology, in our theology, right, in our epics, we have this concept of Dharma Shankata. Damned if I do, damned if I don't. Those are the conversations that people need to talk about, because that's when the company values and the individual values really merge. If this is done on a systematic, regular basis, people will see changes. And of course, all leaders have to be people like Babur, where they are able to show that talk, walk that talk.
Fantastic. So in a way, the Simon Sinek start with why. Right? Yeah. The leader's job is to tell the population, tell the kingdom, tell the soldiers what is the why here. Yeah. Babur said it's jihad. Other leaders might have other messages, but without the why, if you just tell your soldiers that The goal tomorrow is to go to war so that you guys die and I get a bigger kingdom. That's not gonna work.
So and I remember working with a leader in Infosys where, these open house meetings that we used to have every quarter. The PPT with the numbers, the top line and the bottom line numbers, they're important for your shareholders. They're important for the market. But for the employees, they would rather listen to those stories of how they've impacted people.
Lovely.
I think it's a shift in the way you need to show, even the data. It's a shift in how you show the data.
Very interesting. So Sridhar Ganesh has a question for you. So, basis your study of history, what are the two key messages for the leader of today that we need to take away from the book? Two key messages for the contemporary leader.
Relationships first, task later.
Wow.
And it has to happen on a day-to-day basis. You can't just sit up and think about it, number one. Number two, by default, the older you are, the larger the company is. By default, the more bureaucratic you're going to be. And you need to really work on how you're going to be more agile. I would today, when I'm 50, I will put 50% more effort in constantly checking whether I'm being bureaucratic and I'm being set in my ways compared to somebody who's 20 years old.
So just explain that. So relationships first, task second. I got that. Just elaborate on the second point a little bit more.
By default, if I am over 40 years old and my organization is a mature organization for whatever my industry is, it could be 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. By default, I have become bureaucratic. And at least every 6 months, I do a very deep review of processes. And it could be the small things, right? What is the escalation matrix? When do senior people need to be informed or consulted about decisions? The usual abrasion point is between plants and corporate office. Can corporate office delegate more power to the plants? Can senior people today, maybe for every 1 lakh approval, everything goes around 3 chains? Can that 1 lakh become 1 chain? And maybe after 5 lakhs, it becomes 3 chains. Those kind of decisions.
Wow. So basically, don't let the bureaucracy, the process ossify and stifle and suffocate the organization.
And I would say automatically by default, that ossification will happen if you're over 40 and if the organization is a mid-level, mid-aged organization. The third point that I want to add to this is if you want lasting cultural change, it has to happen through commitment, not through compliance.
Wow. Superb stuff. So questions keep getting better. Vivek Pa is asking, what is the role of incentives? How can a leader harness incentives?
I would say incentives are certainly very important. Financial incentives are important, but it also depends on the seniority of the person. Middle level and senior level managers, in my experience, money is important for them, but not everything. I think for them, it's more respect. It is more opportunities. It is more accountability in what they do. But for the junior level, especially today, given the market that everybody has at least 20 offers in their hand and they're thinking of not staying on in an organization for more than a year, money is important. But I still feel somewhere children, employees today at a junior level have far less EQ than most people had generations back. They need that respect. And if we can find ways to give them that respect in their terms, and I think they are an impatient bunch, it will work much faster. And I think the minute we have this conversation in our own mind, oh, my times it was different, today it's different, I think you've lost the battle here because we can't think that.
So Pradeep, just using your books, right? So it's very interesting how in your book you explain how Shivaji's father lets him do some exploratory campaigns before he lets Shivaji lose. Similarly, how Shah Jahan lets Aurangzeb do some exploratory campaigns in the Deccan. So this whole
Hyder Ali did that with Tipu Sultan as well, by the way.
Right. So this whole role of you got a young leader coming through, rather than handing over the entire franchise to them, you give them a small part to go and build and see how they do. You let them learn a few lessons in the real world. If they do well, you give them more responsibility. Let's go on to Bharat Bal's question. Basis your study of history, how do great leaders deal with complacency, especially complacency that comes as you get older and more successful?
They don't. That's the problem. Right. They just don't. The leaders who are not complacent, their empires collapsed.
Right. So if you take example of leaders who fought complacency successfully, and had a great run through
They
their
were
careers.
constantly at their job. It's not on the book, but yesterday I'm
Right.
doing some work on children's history of South India, and I was reading about Rudra Devi of the Kakatiyas in Andhra. 80-year-old woman, she's still fighting battles. Yeah, Malik Ambar died when he was 80. He was still alive and fit, and he had to do what he had to do. Yeah, so age doesn't matter for them. They were on their job. So there is no complacency.
Very interesting. So in a way, you're saying the lessons of history are the leaders who keep at it till they die. They sort of have a decent exit, whereas leaders who sort of lead the life of debauchery and excess, the empire fades away. What happened to the Vijaynagar Empire? What happened to the Vijaynagar Empire happens to them. People sniff the opportunity. And it's actually the more we discuss this with you, the more the parallels between corporate life and history become evident. The questions are positively flying in now. I'll have to be a little selective now because the questions are flying in. If the next generation, right, have you seen examples in history where the next generation initially wasn't really interested in doing the hard yards and becoming the leader, but then subsequently something happened and they became interested in running the kingdom, basically running the family business? Any such case studies come back from reluctant, from history? Any reluctant leaders upping their game and taking charge?
No, but I mean, if you look at Babur's life, for example, when he was wandering about without a home and without a kingdom, I'm sure there would have been many times when he thought he would quit, and he didn't, right? Otherwise, which is why he figures in the book. But hey, at the end of the day, Saurabh, we should be teaching the world about succession planning, because the mother of all, the oldest succession planning book comes from India, the Panchatantra. The whole story of the Panchatantra is about how princes should become great kings, and it came in India. So we don't have the stories of reluctant kings who were forced to become kings, but we certainly, all our stories of kings who eventually made it would have had to struggle to prove their legitimacy with so many people. I mean, look at Ahilyabai Holkar, right? A woman on the throne had to work with all the people around her were men, and this was at a time when it was perfectly okay for a woman not to be treated as equal to men, not even equal, even 10 steps lower, and she still persisted. So I think it's about persistence and being sure that you have to do it, and being very, very agile and flexible about how it's done.
Samir Madan has a beautiful question on risks, right? So he's saying that, from history, we can see that obviously leaders have to take risks. Some risks work out, some risks don't work out, right? The leader loses the battle, loses the kingdom, etc. Right? What are the lessons from history on how to manage risk, which risks to take, which ones to avoid, and what are the lessons that we can bring to corporate life in terms of risk management from history?
I don't know whether there are so many. There's a lesson on risk. It's certainly that they took risks. It's about how to stay persistent despite the risk failing, if you truly know what you are doing, and it's about doing something different. So Shivaji, for example, when he did not fight, he was not chilling out at home and doing nothing. He was working hard on at least the span of administration that he had. He was able to fix that. So when a risk doesn't play out, the lesson is not in not taking a risk again. It's about waiting for the right time to do it, but in that interval, still focusing on core business and managing what you can under your sphere of control.
Very interesting. My colleague Salil Desai has spotted a nice tension in the examples we've cited. On the one hand, we are saying we want diversity. We want leaders who have diverse armies, diverse generals. So we cited Shivaji and Malik Ambar as leaders who deliberately looked for deep diversity in their armies. On the other hand, we are citing leaders like Babur and Martand Verma, who are basically using religion to buy commitment, buy compliance, get buy-in from their kingdoms, from their soldiers, right? What is the best way forward? Is diversity?
Hey, I think you just went on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. So is it diversity or is it emotional connect? Yeah, I think it depends on the issue, because Malik Ambar and Shivaji, the Deccan area, they didn't have much of a choice. It's a very dry area. It's difficult to find people who would be willing to fight. And they wanted people who would be willing to fight the guerrilla warfare, which they didn't have over there. So they imported people. And Deccan was such a difficult area to govern because it was attacked from the north and it was attacked from the south. So people, the kings in the Deccan, which is why Malik Ambar himself became a ruler, kings over there preferred to trust outsiders much more than insiders. So they were also forced to hire a lot of people from outside. Martanda Varma, Akbar, more homogeneous sources, so they could choose from there. So I think it was more a geography-related issue more than anything else. But I guess it also depends on what works for you, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're in a new territory, you don't have that your homogeneous team over there. You'll have to rely on these kind of people. And remember, Malik Ambar and Shivaji, they largely work with a mercenary group, and they were able to emotionally connect with them. Akbar, not so much, but Babur and Martanda Varma, they worked with a homogeneous group. They were able to connect them. So in both cases, there was an emotional connect.
Very interesting. So you're saying make a call on is the team that you're leading, is it homogeneous, is it heterogeneous?
Yeah.
And then make a call accordingly. If you are leading by and large a homogeneous team, then try to identify with them based on some level of group identity.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Let me carry on forward with the fabulous questions we are getting. EQ. Sridhar Ganesh asks, right? It sounds like many of the leaders you're describing, Pradeep, have fabulous EQ, right? Why, and where and why do you think we lost it? I think Sridhar is referring to, we lost EQ somewhere along the way. What happened?
We did. I'll tell you where we lost it. We lost it when our education system became less focused on the arts and on the social sciences. We also lost it when, in the old days, the people who would be doctors in a village, who were usually barbers, and this is across India, and the artists in the village who will stage these plays of our stories, they would be publicly paid by the village. The time when we lost those two arts and the social sciences, we became very focused on one way of doing things. And EQ will come only when we are able to look at diversity. We can have a great argument on whether Aurangzeb was a good king or a bad king. But we can never conclude on that debate because your understanding and definition of good and bad is very different from mine. And I should have the ability to say, look, I don't agree with you, Saurabh, but I cannot say what you're saying is invalid. There's a huge difference. I don't agree with you, but what you're saying is not invalid. I can say that if we're talking about numbers. I can't say that when it talks about people. So the day we made our educational system much more science focused and somehow gave this impression that the arts are not important, social sciences are not important, the day we stopped looking at the Ramayana, the Mahabharata and all the stories as how do they affect me in my dialogue versus, hey, that's just some story that happened, that's a religious thing. I think we lost out a lot on EQ. Because these are eternal. What is the fundamental takeaway from the Mahabharata? If a leader hides behind processes and watches exploitation happen, he or she is going to die in their lives. Dhritarashtra, right? Bhishma. He looks at what is going patently wrong with Draupadi and they hide behind rules and procedures. Number one. Number two, if you see violence happening, if you see exploitation happening and you don't do anything about it, you are as culpable as anybody else and grief is going to befall you. And Rama, what do you see? If you insult the self-respect of another person, even if she is an Rakshasi, blood is going to be spilt on by you.
Lovely.
All of this is EQ.
Yeah, it's a lovely point you make that if the more you get into this rote learning type numerical modern education, and you do that through most of the formative years of your life, right? Then and at age 21, we then expect you to demonstrate EQ in the workplace. It's a bit of a stretch for that youngster. I hadn't thought of it like that, but thank you. Vivek Pai, lovely question. Modern day rulers, leaders, say 20th century rulers, leaders that we can get inspiration in the corporate context.
Oh, that's a difficult question to ask. I'm not gonna name leaders. It can be a controversial thing. I would think that from whatever I've read about from history books, yeah, nobody is a perfect leader. Everybody has their, every idol has feet of clay. I would say pick on some things that work. But this habit of, because Steve Jobs does it, I also have to do it. I don't know whether it works all the time. I think the answer is in being self-aware of what will work for you, what calls to you, and doing that rather than just doing something because somebody else is doing it.
Devidas asks a very perceptive question, right? He says that you must have seen, and he's right, in your book, there are lots of examples of this. You must have seen examples where the parental influence on the leader is very important, right? So Devidas cites the example of Shivaji, where Jijabai's role is well understood in history, the role that his mother played in his, his thinking about Swaraj and building his own identity. Similarly, you mentioned earlier on Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. We discussed Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. For us as parents, now not as corporate leaders, for us as parents, what are the lessons of history?
Kids are going to learn whatever they want to learn from us. Yeah, either it's how to do things, how not to do things. Aurangzeb says this, no? He says the biggest mistake my father made was to trust his children. He should never do that. And then you saw what happened to Aurangzeb's legacy. So kids are going to learn. I think whatever we do, how to do things, how not to do things, kids are going to learn anyway. But personal experience, if you don't, and this is psychology as well, if you don't catch children's behavior by the time they're 10, you pretty much lost it. Because after 10, after 11 years old, they would prefer to be on their own. So if you have kids till 10, you can influence what they're thinking, how they're speaking. But after that, it's a little bit more difficult. But yeah, parents certainly have an important role till about 10 years old.
So I'll finish, Pradeep, with a question that I have to confess is mine. And this sort of troubled me big time. It troubles me a lot in business life as well, right? So in your book, right, there are lots of leaders. We learn a lot from them. We take inspiration from them. But you also have described some leadership tactics which are sort of bordering on the unethical, right? So I'm not going to name rulers here, because if I do, then that will become an outcry. But whether I take leaders from the East, leaders from the West, leaders from the South, almost every region of the country, you've perhaps knowingly highlighted a leadership
where
the leader has done something which is a little underhand and shafted the enemy, won the upper hand in the battle. Now you can see the extension of this dilemma to corporate life, right? Given that history is written by winners, and history celebrates winners, what should we take away from this very uneasy aspect of history, where doing the wrong thing ethically seems to have worked out just fine for some of the greatest men in Indian history?
Well, one thing that I can say about all leaders, and this is true of anybody, and I'm sure all of the people in this call, if they've risen to this level, is somewhere or the other, all of you are survivors. Yeah, just like all those leaders in the past were. However, contexts have changed. I only said human behavior and hasn't changed. Contexts have definitely changed. Today, if you can't get away with many of those things because we're working in organizations in a larger framework. So don't try unethical stuff today. If you try them, it'll come and bite you. You might, like the Satyam case, right? You could do it for a couple of months. You could do it for a couple of quarters, and then the differences became so huge that the whole company collapsed. Yeah. So you can't do that today. You can't compare on the ethics today because you have different rules. You didn't have those rules in those days. It's changed a lot today. But I think that's why it's becoming more important for these kind of books, because you understand how you need to have that persistence, but you also need to have the boundaries for that persistence.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. This was absolutely riveting. We learned plenty. Folks, we might want to read Leadership Shastra. If you do, you'll find plenty of practical examples for business life. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Good night, everybody. Good night, Pradeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.